Well, now, when did you first get the idea that you were going to devote your life to the ministry?
Oh, when I was 7 years old.
7 years old?
Yeah.
A little early, isn't that?
Yes, that's what my parents thought. They thought that I had no business to do what I planned to do, namely to be baptized and join the church on public confession of faith. Mother was quite disturbed. She wanted me, of course, to be a Christian, join the church, but she says, you're only 7 years old. You don't really know what you're doing. And I said, yes, I do, and this is my decision and nobody else's business. So I joined the church on confession of faith, and I was so small that they had to sink a stool in the baptistry for me to stand on so they could immerse me.
Well, now, from the age of 7 on, you didn't go in a straight line with this ambition. Did you waver at any time and think about things?
But I was always, I was going to say desperately, that's not quite the word, profoundly interested in religion. And at that 7-year-old age, I made up my mind that I was going to be a foreign missionary. Behind all my vocational struggle, of course, was the fact that my family, my grandfather, grandmother, father were teachers. And I was strongly drawn to teaching. And in the end, planned to be a teacher. And after I had to give in to the idea that I was so profoundly concerned about religion that religion would have to enter into my vocation, my first decision was not to preach, but to teach religion.
So following the teaching, what were the steps that you took to become a qualified teacher?
Well, of course, I went on from high school to Colgate University and getting a general liberal arts education. My father had taught Latin and Greek, and I didn't know what I was going to teach. But it was during my college course that there came the confluence of the two streams, teaching and religion.
And religion.
And so that when I decided at last to go into the ministry, I wasn't thinking primarily of preaching. Oh, I was going to teach. Oh, perhaps comparative religion. I remember I was fascinated by that, thought perhaps I'd teach. So I really headed toward the ministry in terms of teaching.
Dr. Fosdick, what caused you to turn eventually from teaching to preaching?
Well, there were two major reasons that I could put my finger on. First was a nervous breakdown. If I was going financially to be able to carry on postgraduate study in New York, I had to make way. And I took on a devastating schedule.
Like what?
Well, I was studying philosophy at Columbia under Nicholas Murray Butler and taking a heavy course at the Union Theological Seminary and helping to run a mission on the Lower Bowery. And it did me in. I went to bed one night in November and couldn't sleep. And Stratford-on-Avon is notable to me chiefly not because Shakespeare was born there, but because there for the first time in many, many months I got a night of natural sleep. It was a long struggle back, knocked me out for a year, and brought me face to face with problems of a practical human nature that I never had faced in courses on philosophy and theology.
Ah, yes.
I began to want to get at people living ordinary lives, and began to think less and less of the more intellectual aspects of teaching, more and more about the possibilities of a practical ministry in the church.
Well, now, what was the second?
Well, the second was that in my work on the Bowery, I came face to face with the underdog in his deepest distress. The Bowery in those days was the very limit. It was Skid Row. You ran there into the dregs of humanity, what Theodore Dreiser called the region of forgotten men. And I had lived in an economically poor household, but a protective household with intellectual interests in a more or less academic environment. But now, for the first time, I saw the raw side of human life.
So, in other words, the Bowery was the main experience that changed the whole direction of your career from teaching to preaching to people.
That, and along with the breakdown, brought me face to face with the human problems, so that I gave up the idea of being primarily a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there were other experiences, too, that came along afterwards and confirmed this. At the time of the big Lawrence strike, when the industrial workers of the world had 20,000 men out there for months at Lawrenceville, the Outlook, then one of our leading weeklies, sent me up to cover the strike. Well, there I got tied up with labor conditions.
Was that a shock, too?
That was a shock, too. I saw conditions there that I had never seen before. And I came back and determined that I'd know more about it. So in connection with my pastoral work, I was then a minister in Montclair, New Jersey. I went into Columbia University and took a master's degree in economics and sociology. And I wrote my master's thesis on the development of labor unions in Montclair. Well, I've been interested in the underdog. You know, people think of ministers as living in an ivory tower apart. I've had everything confessed to me: murder, all forms of sexual abnormality, and every kind of human tragedy and sin that you can possibly think of. Oh, for example, I remember that day that Ruby Bates crept...
Excuse me, that was the Scottsboro assault case.
Crept into my office and confessed that she had committed perjury in the first trial of those Negro boys. She had said that the Negro boys had assaulted her. As a matter of fact, they hadn't. Mm-hmm. And I told her to go back, or else she'd be guilty of murder herself. And she did. I'm free to tell it to you now because she went back to the court and confessed her perjury. So that by way of personal counseling, too, I began to come into close contact with...
By the way, I don't want to interrupt you, Doctor, but what effect did that have on the judge and jury in the trial?
I'm sorry to say that they did not affect the judge and jury.
Didn't they make some crack about sending people up to New York?
Yes, the prosecuting attorney said send him up to... And Dr. Fosdick will put him in spats and a frock coat. It was a thoroughly disgraceful trial. And those Scottsboro boys obviously were not guilty.
Well, now the Kabbalah and all the paraphernalia of comparative religions must have seemed very strange to you when you were...
Well, of course, I hadn't surrendered my intellectual interest,
no.
Mr. Cooke. I'm intensely interested in comparative religion and theology and all the other questions, but I never would have been contented to have my life primarily centered there. Of course, I've been fortunate. After I got to work in the practical ministry, the Union Theological Seminary asked me back to teach, and I've been a professor there up until our time of retirement just a few years ago. But primarily, my interest has been in the practical ministry of the church.
Now, don't you find the little irony in the fact, Dr. Fosdick, that you're, I think, associated in the popular mind with a big and respectable and even prosperous church, the Riverside Church?
Yes, and I think on that account I'm rather glad to have this opportunity before so large an audience as you represent here to say that I started not with the Riverside Church. I started with the Bowery. And the conviction of my ministry has been from the beginning that the test of every civilization is what happens to the underdog. That goes back in part to the fact that my own people were for years underdogs here in this country, but it was reinforced by what I saw on the Bowery and in the other relationships of which I have spoken. So that I reached the conclusion that I must roll up my sleeves and go to work where I could get close to people.
Now, something occurs to me that a lot of people may think that you had done your very fine stint down in the Bowery, and then you went to the Riverside Church and turned your back on it. That's not so.
Oh, I'm delighted to have you ask that question. Just north of the Riverside Church, a few blocks, you have one of the most sadly deteriorated municipal areas anywhere in the country. And in this last decade up there, we've been working to save that community, and we're doing it.
This is since your retirement, so-called.
Yes, it started before my retirement. We formed Manhattanville, what is now the Manhattanville Community Centers, and then came the Morningside Incorporated, Heights Incorporated, and we're winning the battle. 10 years ago, the trend of that community was down. Overcrowded tenements, lovely families caught economically in a difficult situation and then wanting desperately to bring up their children finally and unable to do it. And we've gone in there, and the whole trend is now shifted. And there are 3 big public housing projects that are going up there, and give us another 10 years, and we're going to have a community there that the city can be proud of. You ought not to get me talking on this. This has been one of the major interests of my life in the last 10 years. Riverside Church, yes, but Riverside Church is an instrument, one of many instruments, in trying to save our municipal community.
This is the way Dr. Fosdick talked here in the quiet place where he lives in summer. He was already thinking of the fall in New York City and proving once again that the healthiest kind of retirement is one in which you never retire from the things that gave meaning to your own active life.